Dean Corll was born on December 24th, 1939th year in Indiana, in the family of Arnold Edwin Corll and Mary Robinson. Dina had a younger brother, Stanley, who was born in 1942. Arnold was strict with his sons, while Mary defended them. Parents often quarreled and eventually divorced in 1946 year. The boys stayed with their mother after the divorce. Shortly after the divorce, Arnold was drafted into the Air Force in Memphis, Tennessee. After that, Mary sold their house with the children, moved there to Memphis, where she settled in a trailer, so that her sons could keep in touch with their father. In the future, Arnold and Mary made attempts to reconcile. So, in 1950th year, they remarried and moved to Posadue in Texas. But in 1953, they divorced again. After the divorce, Dean and Stanley stayed with their mother again, but continued to see their father often. Then Mary married a traveling watch salesman, Jake West, and the family moved to Vidor, Texas, where Dean had a half-sister, Joyce, in 1955. On the advice of a nut seller, Jake and Mary founded a small family bakery there, Pecan Prince, which was originally located in the garage of their house from that moment until graduation. Dina and Stanley worked at this makeshift factory day and night. Their duties were to monitor the machine that made the products and pack them. As a child, Dean was a shy, serious child. He rarely interacted with other children, but at the same time showed interest in richer peers. At the age of 7, he suffered an undiagnosed rheumatic fever, which was detected only in 1950th year, when he was 10 years old, when the doctors noticed he had a heart murmur. After that, Corll was released from physical education classes at school. From 1954 to 1958, Dean attended Vidor High School. Although he was a diligent student and studied well, his only thing of interest there was the school brass band, in which he played the trombone. Despite the fact that Dean had a reputation as a loner, in his teenage years he dated girls. Dean graduated from high school in the summer of 1958, after which the family moved to the northern suburbs of Houston, so that their business was closer to the city, since it was in Houston that Jake managed to sell most of their products. Here they managed to open a whole store called the same Pecan Prince. In 1960, at the request of his mother, Dean had to move to Indiana to support his widowed grandmother, where he lived for almost 2 years. During this period, he had a close relationship with a local girl, but when she offered to marry him, he refused. In 1962, he returned to his parents to help with the store, which at that time moved to the Houston Heights area. At that time, it was a very economically poor area of Houston. A little later, Dean moved into an apartment above the store. In 1963, Mary divorced Jake and opened her own confectionery business, Corll Candy Company, in which Dean was appointed vice president. That same year, one of the underage employees complained to Mary that Dean was sexually harassing him, but she just fired the guy. On August 10, 1964, Dean was drafted into the Army and was sent for basic training at Fort Polk Base in Louisiana. Later transferred to Fort Benning, Georgia for radio engineering training. After that, his permanent destination was the Fort Hood Base in Texas. According to official military records, Dean Corll's service in the Army was impeccable. However, Dean himself was rumored to hate military service. He submitted his resignation on the grounds that he should help in the family business. His request was granted, and after 10 months of service on June 11, 1965, Dean received an honorable discharge. Several very close acquaintances of Corll told that, as Dean himself told them after returning, it was in the Army that he finally realized his homosexuality. Other acquaintances, to whom he did not say this, reported that they themselves guessed about his orientation when they noticed small changes in his external behavior in those moments when he was in the company of underage guys. After returning from the Army, Dean again became the vice president of their family company. Dean's former stepfather, Jay West, retained ownership of their former business, which is why fierce competition gradually began between Peng Prince and Corll Candy Company. As a result, Dean often had to work from morning to night to meet the growing demand for their factory's products. In 1965, the Corll Candy Company moved to 22nd Street and was located opposite Helms Elementary School. Here Dean often gave out sweets to local children and especially underage guys for free. As a result of this behavior, The nicknames Candyman, Sweetmeat, and Hamilton Kreselev were fixed for him. In turn, the company took several teenagers as cheap labor, and one was seen flirting with some of them. He also installed a billiard table at the back of the factory, where workers often gathered. In June 1968, the candy company closed, after which he went to work as an electrician in Houston, where he checked electrical systems, and Mary and Joyce left for Colorado. And although Mary often spoke with her son on the phone, they never met again in Auku. Dean worked at Houston Lighting and Dean until his death. During the existence of the Corll Candy Company, children and teenagers often gathered around Dean, who spent time with him on the outskirts of the factory. Dean often arranged joint trips with them on the South Texas beach. In 1967 year, Dean met a 12-year-old sixth grader, David Owen Brooks, who was one of those children to whom he distributed sweets for free. David was very insecure because he wore glasses and took a liking to Dean because he did not tease him for his appearance, and always gave pocket money if David asked for it. In the end, David began to treat Dean as a second father. David's parents were divorced and he lived with his father. Dean gradually began to bribe David with money and gifts, and their relationship also gradually went beyond the bounds of what was allowed. At the beginning of 1969 year, Dean persuaded David to have an intimate relationship, and after that often gave him a blowjob. In 1970, David, who was already 15 years old, graduated from school and came to his mother in Beaumont. But every time he visited his father in Houston, he also visited Dean, who allowed him to live in his apartment if David wanted it. However, at the end of the same 1970th year, David returned to Houston and, as he later told, began to consider Dean's apartment as his second home. Between the 13th of December, 1970, and the 25th of July, 1973, Dean Corll kidnapped and killed at least 27 people. All of his victims were boys between the ages of 13 and 20. Most of them were teenagers from one of Houston's neighborhoods called Houston Heights, which was a block of streets 3 kilometers long, no more than 5 kilometers wide, populated mainly by working-class people. In most cases, Corll was assisted by two accomplices, the aforementioned David Owen Brooks and Elmer Wayne Hadley Jr. Several of the victims were friends of Brooks or Hadley, or their mutual friends. Others were people Corll had met beforehand. 11 of Corll's victims attended the same high school. 2 of the victims, Billy Balch and Gregory Molly Winkle, were former employees of the Corll Candy Company. Corll's victims were usually lured by the promise of parties in one of his two cars. The Ford and Colleen van and the Plymouth GTX car were taken to his house. There they were drugged with alcohol or drugs until they lost consciousness and were handcuffed or simply twisted by force. Then the victims were stripped of their clothes and they were usually tied to Corll's bed or to a special torture board that Corll had hanging on the wall. After that, they were raped and beaten, which sometimes lasted several days. The victims were killed in 2 ways: strangled or shot with a .22 caliber pistol, hiding in one of 4 places: in a rented boat shed, on the beach on the Bolivar Peninsula, in the woods near the Sam Rayburn Reservoir. The Corll family had a log cabin on the shore there, in San Agustin County, or on the beach in Jefferson County. There were several cases when Corll forced his victims to write letters to their parents with fictitious reasons for absence, so that they would not worry ahead of time. Corll often kept something for himself as a memento of his victims, most often keys. During the period of the murders, Corll often changed his place of residence, but never went far. 1973, moved to Pasadena. The Houston police, in most cases with the victims of Corll, did not particularly lean on their search, believing that teenagers have an elementary thirst for vagrancy and adventure, and sooner or later they will all come home by themselves. The first known victim today was an 18-year-old freshman at the University of Texas, Jeffrey Allen Conan, who was killed by one. On September 25, 1970. Conan, along with another student, hitchhiked from the university to his parents' house in Houston, arriving in Houston. Conan was dropped off alone at the corner of West May Road and South Hoo, which is not far from the Upper Houston area. Corll was living in an apartment on Yorktown Street near the intersection with West May Road at the time, and probably offered Conan a ride to his parents' house, to which Conan apparently agreed. Forensic experts subsequently determined that the guy was strangled. He was strangled both by the neck and by stuffing a piece of cloth into his mouth as a gag. Conan's naked body with bound hands and feet was covered with lime, wrapped in polyethylene, and buried under a large boulder on High Island Beach. Somewhere around the time of Conan's murder, David Brooke caught Corll torturing two more guys. Corll promised Brooks a car in return for his silence and later bought him a green Chevrolet Corvette. Even later, Corll told Brooks that these guys had been killed and promised $200 for each boy or teenager who could be lured to his apartment. On December 13, 1970, Brooks lured 14-year-olds James Eugene Glass and Danny Michael Yates from Spring Branch, who were returning from a religious rally. It so happened that Glass was familiar with Brooks and had previously even visited Corll's apartment. They were both tortured, raped, and strangled. Their bodies were subsequently buried underground in a boathouse that Corll rented on November 17. 6 weeks later, Brooks and Corll ran into brothers 15-year-old Donald Wayne and 13-year-old Jerry Lynn Waldrep, who were returning home from a friend. The scheme of their murder was similar. They were lured into Corll's car and taken to his rented apartment on Mangum Road, where they were raped, tortured, and strangled. Then they were buried in the same boat shed. Their father is Everett Waldrep. As it turned out later, shortly after their disappearance, he contacted the Houston police, saying that one of his acquaintances allegedly saw Corll burying something similar to the bodies in his boathouse. Police then conducted a cursory inspection around the barn and dismissed Waldrop's information as false. Then, between March and May of 1971, Corll, with the participation of Brooks, kidnapped and killed 3 more boys from Houston Heights, 15-year-old Randall Lee Harvey. The last time his parents saw him was on March 9th when he was riding a bicycle in the Oak Forest, where he worked part-time as a gas station attendant. 13-year-old David William Hillagist and 16-year-old Gregory Molly Winkle. Both were killed on the 29th of May. In the case of Hill and Winkle, Elmer Wayne Hanley first appeared in the case. 15-year-old Hanley was a friend of Hillagist and one of the volunteers helping in the search for the missing. He even personally printed and posted a reward notice all over the district for any information about the boys. Meanwhile, Winkle's mother, like most of the other parents of Corll's victims, the police tried to suggest that her son had simply run away from home, to which she replied, "You don't run away with nothing but swimming trunks and 80 cents on August 17th. Corll and Brooks ran into Brooks' 17-year-old friend Reuben Wilford Watson, who was returning home from a movie theater in Houston. Brooks lured Watson with an offer of a party to Corll's apartment, now on San Felipe Street, where Corll had settled a month before. Then everything went according to the same scenario. In September, Corll moved to another apartment at 915 Columbia Street. Brooks later told the police that during the period when Corll lived there, and literally up to the day when Elmer Wayne Henley came on the scene, they kidnapped and killed 2 more guys. Moreover, Corll held one of them hostage for 4 whole days before he killed him. The identity of these guys could not be established. Elmer Wayne Hanley was born in Houston on May 9, 1956, and was the eldest of 4 sons of Elmer's sister, and Mary Wheat. The father was an alcoholic and beat his wife and children. Despite this, Mary tried to give her children a good education and protect them from adult problems. When Elmer was 14, his parents divorced, and all 4 sons stayed with Mary. At first, Elmer did well at school, but after his parents divorced, in order to help his mother support the family, he got a part-time job as a laborer. His grades deteriorated sharply, and he began to skip school. During this period, he met David Brooks, who was a year older than him. Hanley and Brooks often skipped classes together when he was 15. Hanley finally dropped out of school. Through Brooks, Hanley met Corll, and there is speculation that Brooks brought Hanley to the latter's apartment as a victim. However, Corll saw in the guy the potential for a future accomplice and did not touch him. At first, Hanley did not pay attention to the true relationship between Brooks and Corll, although he guessed about the orientation of the latter. But at the same time, I admired him for his hard work. Since 1971, Hanley began to spend a lot of time in Corll's company. Hanley did not know about the murders at first. Corll had convinced him that he and Brooks were only involved in robberies. With his submission, Brooks robbed several houses together with them, for which he received some money. At some point, Corll asked, clearly for the purpose of testing, if he could kill if necessary. To which Hanley replied in the affirmative. Hanley found out part of the reason for the disappearance of the local guys in the winter of the same 1971 year, when Brooks brought him back to Corll's apartment, saying that a profitable business was planned. However, Corll deceived Hanley here too. He told him that he was connected with an organization in Dallas that kept young boys in sexual slavery. Like Brooks, Hanley was offered a fee of $200 for each boy caught. Hanley later told the police that he had ignored Corll's offer for several months, but the difficult financial situation of his family eventually forced him to agree at the beginning of 1971 year. The identity of the first victim, who was abducted with the participation of Hanley, remained unknown, but presumably it was 17-year-old Willard Carmen Branch from New Forest, who disappeared on February 17, 1972, whose castrated body was later found buried in a boathouse. Corll, according to Hanley, at that time lived in the house 925 on Schuler Street, where he moved in the same month. But Brooks later told the police that during Hanley's first participation, Corll lived at another address. Branch, if it really was him, was lured by the promise of smoking marijuana. And although Hanley personally handcuffed the victim's hands, tied her legs, and taped her mouth with tape, he still had no idea about the last murder. The truth was fully revealed to Hanley a month later, on March 24, 1972, when he similarly lured his 18-year-old friend Frank Anthony Aguirre to the throat, whom the three of them saw leaving the restaurant on the street where he worked. But this time, Corll personally twisted the victim, and it was his abuse that opened his eyes, and he found out what had become of the previous abducted boys, including Corll, and Brooks admitted that they killed his friend David Helgest. According to Hanley, he begged Aguirre not to kill him, but he did not listen to him. Even knowing the terrible truth, Hanley accepted from Brooks and helped them bury Aguirre's body on High Island Beach. Upon interrogation, Brooks said that it was during the period when Corll lived on Schuler Street that Hanley had outright sadistic tendencies, which could indirectly explain why he agreed to continue helping Corll. A month later, on April 20th, Hanley helped Corll kidnap his other friend, 17-year-old Mark Stephen Scott. In the case of the latter, there was almost a misfire. When Corll tried to twist Scott, he began to resist violently, and at some point armed himself with a knife, which caused him to have a gun on him. As with Aguirre, Scott was buried on High Island. On May 21st, the trio kidnapped two more guys, 17-year-old Billy Jean Balch Jr. and 16-year-old Johnny Delamy. They were personally killed by Hanley himself. First, he strangled Balch, and then he shot Delamy in the forehead. But he was still alive, as the bullet came out of his ear. And then Hanley strangled him. Balchy Delamy was also buried on High Island. Somewhere in the same period, when Corll lived on Schuler Street, there were two cases in which the case did not go according to the usual plan. In the first case, the trio lured 19-year-old Billy Ridinger, who, like the other victims, was tied to a torture board and beaten by Corll. But then Brooks, in his own words, persuaded Corll to let Ridinger go. Ridinger didn't say anything to anyone and today is considered to be the only victim of Corll that he released. The second case was that somehow Hanley, having come to Corll, stunned Brooks, after which Corll tied him to the bed, and abused him several times. Brooks, despite this, however, continued to help Corll further. On June 26th, Corll left Schuler Street and moved to Westcote Towers, where he killed two more guys. 17-year-old Steen Sin, he was last seen on July 19th, shortly before midnight, when he was heading to a party in Houston Heights. 19-year-old Roy Eugene Bunton. His abduction occurred around the 21st of August, when he was on his way to the Houston shoe store where he worked. Sickman was beaten in the chest with a blunt object and was strangled. Bunton was shot twice in the head. Both were buried in the boathouse. Neither Hanley nor Brooks ever mentioned the names of Sickman and Bunton, or in the year 2011. Both were recognized as victims, since earlier their remains were mistakenly identified as his other victims. On the 2nd of October, Hanley and Brooks ran into Olia J. Simon and Ratchard Hambry as they were walking to the latter's house. In the evening of the same day, Simon called home, but only Mom managed to shout into the phone, after which the connection was cut off. They were killed only the next day. And according to Brooks, Hanley accidentally shot Hambry in the jaw with a .22 caliber pistol. When he entered the room where both were tied up, both were later strangled and buried in the boathouse, right over the bodies of James Glass and Danny Yates. A month later, the trio abducted 19-year-old Richard Kepner as he was heading to a pay phone to call his fiancée. He was buried on High Island. In all, between February and November of 1972, the trio abducted and killed at least 10 teenagers between the ages of 13 and 19. 5 were buried on the beach in a barn. On January 20, 1973, Corll moved to Worth Road in the Springs Branch area. 2 weeks later, on February 1st, 17-year-old Joseph Lyles was killed there, who was familiar with the Eagle. And Brooks Lyles lived on Antoine Drive, where Brooks Henley lived in this murder in 1973, probably did not participate. Since during the same period, he temporarily moved to Mount Pleasant and tried to enlist in the American Navy. But his application was rejected due to the fact that he did not receive a full secondary education. And soon Hanley returned to Corll's company. Hanley was clearly trying to distance himself from Corll, which is why he moved to Mount Pleasant. This indirectly confirms his interview of 2010 year, where he said that he could not leave Houston because he suspected that Corll was looking at one of his younger brothers. On the 7th of May, Corll left the apartment on Vi and moved to an apartment in 2020 Lamar Drive. Presumably, in the period from February to the 3rd of June, 1973. The Trinity did not kill anyone, or in any case, it was not possible to establish such cases for certain. This was probably caused both by Henley's departure to Mount Pleasant and by the fact that at the beginning of 1973, Corll got a dropsy testicle. However, since June, the rate of Corll murders has increased significantly. Henley and Brooks later testified that the level of brutality of murders during La Lara's residence also increased markedly. Hanley even claimed that Corll's madness had reached such a limit that he and Brooks gradually began to guess in advance from Corll's external behavior when he would order to look for a new victim. Between June and July of 1973, the trio committed 7 more murders of boys aged 15 to 20, of which Henley participated in at least 6. On the 4th of June, 15-year-old William Ray Lawrence was abducted, last seen by his father on 31st Street. After William found himself in Corll's house, he was forced to write a note addressed to his father, in which Lawrence explained his flight and promised that he would return at the end of August, among all known victims of Corll. William Lawrence was subjected to the most sophisticated torture. According to Hanley's testimony, Dean Corll showed strong sympathy for Lawrence, thanks to which the guy remained alive. Handcuffed to plywood for 3 days from the moment of abduction, during which he was repeatedly raped and subjected to various bullying, and then strangled. Lawrence's corpse was buried at Sam Rayburn Reservoir. Less than 2 weeks later, 20-year-old hitchhiker Raymond Blackburn was buried there. On the 6th of July, 1973, Hanley began taking lessons at a coaching driving school in Bellary, where he met 15-year-old Homer Luis Garcia. The next day, Garcia called his mother and said he would spend the night with a friend. On the same night, he was shot and bled to death in Corll's bathtub, after which he was buried in the same reservoir. 5 days later, on July 12th, 17-year-old Marine John Manning Sellers from Origi, also being shot, was buried on High Island. Later, during the trial of Henley, a forensic expert suggested that Sellers could not have been killed by Corll. He was prompted by the fact that of all the identified victims, Sellers was the only one who was shot 4 times in the chest. Not from a pistol, which was used in the case of other victims, but from a rifle of unknown caliber, and who was buried in clothes. Hanley and Brooks never named Sellers in the testimony, but they never denied that he could have been a victim of Corll. However, there were several factors indicating that Sellers belonged to the victims of Corll. Grave of Sellers was located close to the graves of other victims of Corll. His hands and feet were similarly tied, and he was the same age as the other victims. Finally, during the investigation, the police came to a certain truck driver who reported that near the place where Sellers' body was buried, he once saw a young guy, presumably Hanley, who had a truck stuck in the sand. The guy refused the offer to help, explaining that there are 2 friends with him who will help him. Nevertheless, the investigation of 1974 excluded Sellers from the list of Corll's victims. In July 1973, Brooks was forced to marry and temporarily left Corll as a result of which, according to Henley, he did not take part in 3 murders that occurred between the 19th and the 25th of July. The first victim was 15-year-old Michael Sh, the younger brother of Billy Bach, whom Corll killed in May of '72, who was last seen on the 19th of July on his way to the barber shop. He was strangled and buried in a reservoir. The other 2 victims, Charles Carey Coble and Marty Ray Jones, were abducted on July 25th, but they were killed only 2 days later. After the bullying, the guys were tied to each other with the wrist and ankle of one to the wrist of the ankle of the other. And they forced him to fight because Corll said that the guy who would beat the other to death would be released. A few hours later, Jones was tied to a torture board, while Coble was again abused and shot in front of his eyes. Jones was then strangled with a blind cord. The couple was buried in a boathouse. Hanley buried them personally. When the police dug up Jones' body, he found his mouth wide open, which, according to police, indicated that Jones was screaming at the time of death. The last victim of Corll is believed to have been killed on August 3, 1973, 13-year-old James Stanton Dreimela, who was buried in the boathouse. David Brooks mentioned how he bought Dreimela pizza and spent 45 minutes in his company before the guy was tortured. Hanley did not participate in his murder. On the evening of August 7, 1973, 17-year-old Hanley lured 19-year-old Timothy Cordell Curley to Corll's apartment, where they sat until midnight, inhaling a couple of paints and singing alcoholic beverages. Then they left to buy sandwiches. After that, Curley decided to take Hanley home in his Volkswagen. But at the latter's house, they ran into Hanley's neighbor, 15-year-old Rhonda Louise Williams, who was beaten up by her drunken father that evening, and she wanted to go somewhere for a while until he sobered up. Hanley then suggested that Williams spend the night at Liz' apartment, after which the 3 of them went to Posad. At about 3 o'clock in the morning on the 8th of August, the trio arrived at the throat. He was furious that he had brought a girl, took him aside, accused him of violating confidentiality. However, it seemed to Hanley that he calmed down when the latter explained to him that Williams just temporarily did not want to return home because of a quarrel with his father. Corll then offered the trio beer and marijuana, while he himself did not touch alcohol and drugs. After about 2 hours, all 3 of them passed out. When Hanley woke up, his mouth was taped shut, his legs were tied, and Corll was handcuffing his hands. Williams and a completely naked Curley were already tied up next to each other. Noticing that Hanley had woken up, Corll tore off the tape and reported that he was very angry with Hanley, that he would kill them all. He kicked Williams in the chest several times, then carried Hanley into the kitchen and put a .22 caliber pistol to his stomach. Hanley tried to calm him down, assuring him that he would participate in the torture and murder of the couple. Corll believed him and untied him. Then he carried Curley Williams to his bedroom and tied them on both sides to the torture board. Curley belly down, Williams belly up. He then handed Hanley a hunting knife and demanded that he cut Williams' clothes. While Hanley was doing this, Corll undressed and began to torment Curley. Williams had woken up by that time and began to panic, which is why Hanley asked Corll for permission to move her to another room. Corll ignored Hanley's request, and Hanley, seizing the moment, grabbed a gun and shouted, "You've gone too far, Dean." He pointed it at Corll. Corll then started attacking him with the words "Kill me, Wayne," Hanley's middle name. "You won't do that." Then Hanley fired, and the bullet hit the throat in the forehead, but he continued to stand. Hanley fired 2 more shots and hit the left shoulder. Corll turned around and left the room, but crashed into the wall of the hallway. Hanley fired 3 more shots and hit the lower back and shoulder, after which Corll slid to the floor and died, lying face to the wall. Hanley later recalled that the most paradoxical thing about the current situation was that it was Corll who taught him to use spontaneous decisions and act, which resulted in the fact that he managed to shoot him before Corll tried to take the gun away. Hanley then released Curley Williams and suggested they just go home. But Curley persuaded him to call the police. At 8:42 in the morning, telephone operator Velma Lance connected Hanley with the Pasadena police. While they were waiting for the police, sitting on the porch of the house, Hanley once briefly said to Curley, "I could get $200 for you." The police were initially skeptical of Hanley's words, blaming his behavior on the effects of shock and drugs. The police believed him only when he gave several names of the murdered boys Hillagist, Jones, and Coble. And a search of Corll's apartment revealed things proving that acts of violence were carried out there. Among those found were 8 pairs of handcuffs and many artificial penises. And in the backyard of the house, the police found a box with strands of human hair, which Corll used to transport corpses. The hair belonged to Charles Coble. The search of the Ford Icon line Corlla also pointed to the correctness of Henley's words. Its rear windows were sealed with opaque blue curtains, and a beige carpet with soil stains was found in the very back. And another box, similar to the one in the backyard. In the boathouse, the police found a children's bicycle, a half-disassembled car that was stolen in March from a used car park, and a box with the clothes of the victims. In the boathouse that day, it was the 8th of August, the police dug up 8 corpses. In the evening of the same day, David Brooks, accompanied by his father, came to the Houston Police Department, gave evidence in which he denied all involvement in the murders and admitted only that he knew about 2 murders of Corll, which he committed in 1970. The next day, Henley gave full testimony, in which he fully admitted his complicity and refuted Brooks' statement, explaining that since his cooperation was scrapped, there were only 3 cases in which Brooks did not participate. On the same day, the police brought Henley to Sam Rayburn Reservoir. The police found a second torture board in Corll's hut, rolls on polyethylene, scoops, and a bag of lime. 2 lime-soaked graves were found near the road. On the evening of the 9th of August, 9 more corpses were unearthed in the boathouse. Among them were the Waldrop brothers, who were immediately identified thanks to their identity cards, one of whom had his genitals cut off, which were buried in a sealed bag next to the victim. On the same day, Brooks gave new testimony in which he admitted that he was present at some of the murders, and later helped bury the bodies. He mentioned that in one of the cases, together with Henley, he arrived in Corll's van, inside of which there was the corpse of another victim at the Sam Rayburn Reservoir in order to bury the murdered man. But before doing that, he and Henley spent several hours fishing on the shore. Nevertheless, despite these confessions, Brooks still denied any direct involvement in the murders. Corll's torture of the victims, Brooks commented as follows: "As soon as they were on the board, they were already dead. It was all over, just screaming and crying." On August 10th, Henley led the police to 2 more graves at the reservoir. The bodies were buried at a depth of 3 meters. And then he and Brooks showed 2 more burials on High Island Beach on August 13th. Henley and Brooks were brought back to High Island Beach, where 4 more burials were found. The body of George Sellers was also found. In total, at that time, 28 bodies were found in the police, which became the saddest record in serial murders in the United States. Earlier in 1971 year, Juan Valleja Corona was arrested in California, who had 25 male migrants on his account. However, the record was broken already in 1978 year when John Wayne Gacy Jr. was arrested. There were 33 people on his account. During one of the experiments, the police were accompanied by a reporter from the Houston TV channel, Jack Cato, who gave Henley his radio phone so that he could contact his mother. While Kate was filming him, Henley briefly told her, "Mom, I killed Dean." A recording of this moment was broadcast that evening on Cypress TV, and then was shown on national television, on the NBC program Nightly News. By April 1974, 22 victims had been identified. Many of the bodies were identified because Social Security cards, driver's licenses, and other personal belongings were found next to their decomposed remains. Jimmy Glass family was only able to identify him because his beloved leather jacket was next to his skeleton. In 1983, Richard Kepner was identified as Willard Carmen Branch in 1985, Randall Lee Harvey in 2008, Joseph Lyles in 2009, Roy Bunton in 2011. The police decided not to consider John Sellers as a victim of Corll, so today the official number of victims is 27 people. Since David Brooks testified that Dean Corll committed the first known murder alone, that the real number of Corll's victims could have been much more, since from 1968 to 1970. The Houston Police Department's Juvenile Affairs Department received several thousand reports of missing children and teenagers. In order to search for the burial of other potential victims of Corll during the investigation of the murders, police excavated the territory of the backyard of Corll's house in Pasadena, and a search was conducted on the territory of an old confectionery factory. Larry Earls, a homicide detective who took part in the exhumation work, subsequently stated that both Henley and Brooks repeatedly stated in August 1973 that there was a possibility that the real number of victims of Dean Corll was unknown. And there are a number of other places that Corll used to like to visit, where, in their opinion, there may be other burials. However, as soon as the number of discovered victims exceeded the record of mass murders in the United States, the excavations were stopped because Houston was subjected to negative publicity in the media. On August 13th, a grand jury met in Harris County to hear testimony against Hanley and Brooks. The first witnesses were Rondo Williams and Tim Curley. The second one was Billy Reisinger, who came in here with a bag on his head. After a hearing that took more than 6 hours, on August 14th, the jury indicted Henley on 3 counts of murder, and Brooks on 1 count. Bail for each of them was set at $100,000. The district attorney demanded that Henley undergo a psychiatric examination to determine how competent he is to stand trial. But his lawyer, Charles Melder, opposed it, saying it would violate Hanley's constitutional rights. By the time the trial was over, Hanley had been charged with 6 murders committed between March 1972 and July 1973. To Brooks for committed between December 1970 and July 1973. The murder of Dean Corll was recognized as self-defense, and the indictment against Hanley was not included. Elmer Wayne and Henley and David Owen Brooks were tried separately. Henley's trial began in San Antonio on July 1, 1974. When the police and forensic experts described the processes of torture and murder, the parents of some victims had to leave the courtroom to regain their composure. 82 proofs were presented. On the advice of his defense attorney Ed Pegulo, Henley did not testify from his point of view. His second lawyer, Will Gray, cross-examined several witnesses, but did not call witnesses or experts for the defense. On the 15th of July, both sides presented their closing arguments to the jury. The prosecutor's office demanded a death sentence for Henley. Defense of acquittal. District Attorney Carol Vance, in his closing speech, apologized for his inability to seek the death penalty, adding that this case was the most vivid example of human cruelty to man of all that he had ever encountered. The court deliberated for 92 minutes, after which, on July 16th, Elmer Henley was found guilty of all 6 murders and sentenced to 6 terms of 99 years for a total of 594 years. Henley appealed the verdict, pointing out that the trial was not closed and that the request of his lawyers to remove the press from the hall and the indication that the initial trial should not have been held in San Antonio were not satisfied by the judge. The appeal was granted, and he received a retrial in December 1978. Of June 1979, a new trial began, which lasted 9 days. The lawyers, the same Pilo and Gray, tried to prove the inadmissibility of the affidavits of August 9, 73. Since, according to them, they look as if they were written by their father and not from themselves personally. But Justice Kennedy found them permissible. On June 27, 1979, after 2 hours of discussions, the court upheld the verdict. The trial of David Brooks began on February 27, 1975. Although his indictment contained charges of 4 murders, he was brought to trial only for the murder of William Lawrence. Brooks' lawyer, James Kelton, argued that his client did not commit the murders and tried to put all the blame on the throat, and partly on Henley. But Assistant District Attorney Tommy Dunn rejected all of his demands. Brooks' trial lasted less than a week, and on the 4th of March, after 90 minutes of deliberation, the jury found him guilty of Lawrence's murder and sentenced him to life imprisonment. Brooks showed no emotion at the time of the verdict, but his young wife burst into tears. Brooks also appealed the verdict, claiming that he signed a confession when he was not informed of his legal rights. But in May of 1979, his appeal was rejected. On the 8th of July, 1980, Elmer Henley filed his first application for early release, which, like all subsequent ones, were rejected. Henley is currently being held at the Mark Michael Prison in Anderson County. David Brooks was being held in Terrell Prison near Rocheron. Because of the death toll, the exact number of victims killed in the period from September 1970 to 1973, as well as the period of the murders itself, cannot be accurately determined. In total, 28 remains were found, of which 27 were officially recognized as victims of Corll. There is also a 28th victim attributed to Corll, but her remains have not been found. The victims, however, could have been much more, since in total in Houston, from 1970 to the death of Corll, 42 boys were reported missing, including the officially identified victims of Corll. It is assumed that Corll could have started killing even before Brooks and Hanley were involved in the case, or he could have committed some murders without their participation. On August 13, 1973, the search for bodies was stopped, although Elmer Hanley insisted that there were 2 other boys who were buried on High Island Beach in 1972. Presumably, it was Joseph Lyles and Mark Scott. Lyles' body was accidentally discovered only in 1983 and identified only in 2009. Mark Scott today remains the only victim of Corll, whose body has not yet been found, and most likely it will never be found, because in September of the 2008 year, Hurricane Ike swept through High Island, as a result of which this area remains flooded today. In February 2012, a blurred Polaroid image of the alleged but unidentified victim of Corll was published in the media. Found among Elmer Hanley's personal belongings, which his family had kept since his arrest. The picture shows a teenager whose hands are handcuffed to an indistinguishable device on the floor. The Harris County Medical Examiner's Office excluded this boy from the list of all 27 official victims of Corll, and at the same time recognized him as the 28th victim. No body has been found yet. When Hanley was shown the photo, he could not remember this boy, but he remembered that the camera on which it was taken belonged to him, and was bought in 1972. Thus, this boy was among the victims killed in 1972 in 1970. 1994, at the suggestion of a Louisiana art dealer, Elmer Hanley began painting paintings, considering it partly as a hobby, partly as an attempt to support his mother financially. The themes of his paintings are landscapes, portraits, buildings, or flowers in an atmosphere of serenity. Hanley always paints portraits of people in black and white because he suffers from color blindness, but the rest of the paintings are painted in color. In 1997 year, the Hythe Park Gallery in the Houston area, Nettown, held the first exhibition of Hanley's works, which caused the indignation of the relatives of some of the victims in 1999 year. When the Houston authorities expressed the idea of building a monument to the victims, Hanley said he was ready to donate money from the sale of his canvases for this. Since 1979, Hanley and Brooks have applied for parole more than 20 times, but they were always refused because of the protest of the relatives of the victims, because of the severity of the crimes committed by them while in prison in different years. Elmer Hanley gave several interviews to journalists. In the 2011 year, during one of them, he stated that in the decades since his arrest, he had only once attempted to contact David Brooks and sent him a letter. However, despite the fact that Brooks replied to him, neither he nor Hanley maintained any further relations. During the years of imprisonment, David Brooks avoided publicity and maintained relationships only with family members and a number of close friends. In December of 2000, he agreed for the first time to an interview that he gave to Sharon Derrick, who was engaged in DNA research of the remains of Corll's victims who were not identified, at the Harris County Institute of Forensic Medicine. During the interview, Brooks discussed his role in the mass killings for the first time in 33 years after his arrest. Brooks also mentioned that his only daughter, who was born in 1973, shortly after his arrest, she died in a car accident on the day of graduation after graduation. In October of the turn of the 15th year, Elmer Hanley filed another application for parole, but he was refused. Once again, he will be able to file a petition in October 2025 year, when he turns 69 years old. David Brooks in February 2000 of the 18th year also filed another petition for parole, but he was similarly refused, and prohibited from filing such petitions until 2028 year. And on the 28th of May, 2020, David Brooks died in a Houston hospital at the age of 65, after a long illness due to complications caused by a